welcome. And hello, I'm Terry McGill. I'm in Portland, Oregon. And you can probably read down at the bottom, who's your neighbor? And, you know, we're a global community or a global village. With the internet, it was especially important when COVID came into it was like it wasn't even in our rearview mirror, and then wham. And that was what started this show. My awareness, anyway, of how COVID and the isolation was affecting people. And it was suggested to me that I do something like this, whether you call it a webcast or a visual blog or a podcast or whatever. We've been doing these every Tuesday night for I'm not sure how many episodes, and one a week. Sometimes we repeat because life says, well, that person's internet was out. That other person, actually, one of our scheduled guests came down with COVID. So we are, and welcome to all of those that are watching us. Hello, and thank you for joining. And some of you will be watching in the future because this is recorded. It's streaming live right now on Facebook, and there'll be a YouTube recording as well as the one that seems to be preserved forever by Facebook. So welcome everyone to another episode of Who's Your Neighbor? Tonight, we have one of the most fascinating people, and I'm not going to go, he's been here before, so you may have seen. His name is Russell Fox, and he was a professional conductor for a long time. And now he has a title that I would like for you to read, and then I'll read it also because it's too long for me to hold. It is just amazing. So it's SHEN Therapy, Biofield Therapeutics for Physio-Emotional Recovery and Empowerment. Now, if that doesn't cover everything, I don't know what does. So tonight, the subject is one that I didn't expect from Russ. So it's grief. And I had a SHEN therapy session with Russ earlier today. And you may not be surprised, but grief came up from my childhood and that I still carry. And I'm not going to try to give you the background of how this can happen, but I want to invite Russ on, and I invite you to welcome him again if you saw him before. Hello, Russ.
How are you doing, Terry? Good to see you.
Well, I'm integrating after our session today, and yes. I'm hoping that you will touch on, and feel free to, anything that you want to share about our session today, as you were at one point was dealing with some grief that I evidently was still carrying. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you just unwind everything for our audience.
Well, the subject of grief is not one that is, it's not bar talk. This is not something that is generally something we want to spend a lot of time thinking about, except it affects us all. And so it's a good idea that in a situation like this, where this program being supported by the Dow Center of Portland and being an offering of public service, let's talk about things that matter. And grief is one of those. And just trying to get a handle on what is it? Where does it come from? How is it different than other emotions? The questions are deep. It's simple for us to say this. Now, Do I know grief? 2.5 years ago, I buried my wife of 51 years. Before that, we buried all four of our grandparents. All four of our parents and five of our grandparents. Loss, separation, that sense that something has just died inside my soul, and I can't get it gone. I can't release myself from it. What is going on? Now, if we just take a look at the word grief, it's kind of interesting. It's been a long time since I looked up that word just to see what do other people think it is. And what comes up is sorrow, loss, sadness, pain, anguish, those kinds of things. But they all seem to be dancing around as descriptions of something else that isn't something we talk about. Grief is something we feel. Grief is something that is deep within us, feels like it's deep. There's a hole in our soul, if I can put it that way. And there are other. We were talking earlier off camera about English being a poor language sometimes for discussing something, because as in the word love, I can say to Terry, as a brother and as someone I've known now for several years, I really love you, man. That kind of a brotherly love, a love between a wife, a love between two young star-crossed lovers. Love has so many different aspects to it. And grief is another one of those words. How do you define it? Well, you try to define it by saying, what started it? Where did this thing come from? Well, my parent didn't treat me well. I felt like I lost out on something, and I have felt that grief and sadness ever since. Oh, yes, I was 3 and 4 years old, quote unquote. I've heard this so many times, and I could say it myself. I learned when I was 2 years old in a crib that these big people, I couldn't really trust them, and I've been grieving that ever since. There's a big story behind that, and maybe one day I'll tell it. But grief is something that lives inside of us. It's not a mental construct. It's not something I have come up with, and therefore, oh, okay, I think grief. No, I feel grief. I feel sadness. I feel sorrow. Now just take a look at what I'm doing here. Unconsciously, if I asked any of you to say, okay, where do you feel grief? Well, obviously right here. Why don't I feel grief in my belly or in my hips or in my left knee? Well, we feel all of our emotions in our bodies. When we talk about SHEN as a therapy, we generally look at it this way. We are, I'll use the term hardwired, and then I'll have to explain myself, but we are hardwired to sense various emotions in very specific locations. Anything that relates to sadness, grief, and mourning, it's in the chest. There's no doubt about it. We would call that the area of our heart. If I said shame, where do you feel shame? Guilt, well, that self-judgment that says I'm not good enough, or I don't know, I'm not sure I'm okay with this. Well, that is in the lower gut, and it's always in the lower gut, that sense of shame, and we double over because it causes us to contract. Grief does the very same thing. People who are racked with grief or brokenhearted or have a heaviness of heart, they are suffering from heartbreak I mean, you see, even our language contains the location of that sensation. I mean, to me, that's very, very interesting. But why is it that in each case, these painful emotions cause us to contract? It's as I grab my shirt. You can see the lines of that's set up in my shirt. And this is precisely what happens in our tissues. At the point where we have been impacted by a difficult emotion, we sense contraction, a tightness, a heaviness. Something doesn't move. And did I think myself into that? Well, let me just explain this. And Terry, I want you to jump in if there's a question. However, let me just say this first. The way we look at emotions is the way you might want to consider a computer, all right? A computer, this thing that I have in front of me that we all know what it is these days. It's got hardware in there. And it also then has these apps, these programs, and a memory bank. The machine has the memories, and all the memories are in there. Well, how does the brain and the body work? My brain is a repository of tons of facts. It's my hard drive. Okay, let's just say it's my hard drive. The emotion that I'm feeling, that's the app. If I have a drawing app, well, then it pulls all the necessary items in my hard drive together that allows me to make lines and spaces and colors and sizes. Okay, fine. If I'm feeling grief, my brain says, okay, my job is to provide all the information that's necessary to justify this feeling that's dominant. Now, if I'm angry at you, Terry, and I lose my temper, and I yell at you, heaven forbid this should ever happen, but I might say some terrible things. I might say some things that, well, at the time, I've just kicked in, oh yeah, well, I remember when somebody did something like this to me, and so therefore, boom, you're the recipient of all my rage. It's perfectly justified. 5 minutes later, when I sit back and that emotional state is no longer there, I say to myself, what did I say that to Terry for? He's my dear friend. I didn't mean to hurt him. Why did I do that? Because logic and reason are functions of emotion. The brain is there to justify and to support whatever emotion is up. So when you're in full mode of grief and you feel that in your chest, it's hard to think of anything else. It's hard to think happy thoughts. It's hard to, a cute puppy just isn't that cute anymore. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I got it immediately. A friend of mine
instantly, the moment that I change my emotional state, oh, suddenly logic and reason now rebalance to adjust that one. I never think about when I was embarrassed as a kid, unless something around me happens and I find myself being embarrassed. And suddenly I'm 6 years old again. And I remember that time when Johnny did this and I felt terrible and I scrunched in around it because in my lower gut. And now all I can think of is how terrible Johnny was. And so therefore this person must be also. And you know, you can play all the games you want with mind over matter or mind over thought. But the fact is, you're trying to stuff down a feeling state that if you're honest with what you're feeling, the brain is just going to kick out whatever's necessary to justify that. There's the question. How do you deal with emotions if they are not mental processes? If our mental processes are the result of emotions, how do you deal with the emotion? Any answers, Terry?
I'm waiting.
Well, before we get to that answer, I have some other question that has to be resolved. Let's take I hate to talk about age, but let me just talk about age. When a couple has lived a long life together, and let's assume that they've been a happy couple and have found great joy in each other's arms and in each other's company, and when one of them passes away, it's very normal for the remaining spouse to say, we had a good life. It was rich. It was wonderful. And now may they rest in peace. May she rest in peace in my case. It's time to let go. And I'll be fine, but I don't want to feel so terrible because it was a wonderful time. Most people don't get this rich experience that we just had. The person who suppresses that level of very natural grief is usually dead within 6 months of either pulmonary or respiratory, heart, coronary, anything that's in this area, heart failure, pneumonia. How is it that emotion held translates into physiological difficulties? Now, I read an article literally just today, and I have forwarded it to other people, but it has to do with grief in the Black community. And that how, because of the history of slavery and the unnaturally electric dynamics we have around race relations in the US, that the level of grief in the Black community has translated into a greater degree of death through heart attacks, through immune suppression, immune system difficulties. Well, where's your immune system? It sits right there with your thymus gland, still in that area of the heart. So the question would be, what are emotions? If they don't come from the brain, if the brain is responding to them, and then putting out neurotransmitters and instantly sending messages to the rest of our body, I need this chemical there, make it happen, to support. What is it that we are responding to? For those of you who are in the working with the Dow Center of Portland and Dow Hands, and I'll mention things that some of you may not understand, but that's fine. You'll come to understand what we're talking about. But in the ancient wisdom set that we know and love, this Dr. and Master Shah, who has made this much more available to us so we can understand it and use this, we talk about one very important thing, and that is there's nothing physical. We know that we are a field of energy. And we talk about being a vibration, a series of vibrations, and a field, if you will. I'd like to amplify on that just a bit. Number one, we are multiple fields. My heart has a field. My solar plexus has its own field. My lower gut has a field. My throat, my crown, my third eye, if you will. They are all independent fields which together work as one. They intersect, they interact, they interplay. And through resonance, it's basic physics, through resonance, one can affect the other. So if we just start with the fact that I have a field of energy that sits in my chest, Not going to get too specific about it, but there's a full anatomy that one can look at and understand. Oh, this is how that field works. Oh, now I get it. If in that field there is a contractive response in that field, if it's reacting to something which has that vibration into it, grievous or happy, sad or exaltation, there's either a contractive state or there is an expansive state. That field, that rotating and circulating donut, if you will. I mean, you've all seen pictures of a hurricane, right? As it's marching across the ocean and it's turning around, and it's also wind up through the middle, out through the downside. Those who've had basic physics, you know that's called a toroid. Well, we are a collection of toroids. This particular one holds grief. And when it is going slow, the body starts to react, saying something is wrong here. Now, if I break a bone, guess what happens to the soft tissue? The soft tissue starts to get tense. The muscles start to get turn into its own splint. It's a very natural process. Huh. It's called the splinting reflex to some people, but it's an autocontractile pain response. The body doesn't know the difference between a broken bone, physical pain, or emotional pain. Something's disrupting its normal state, and we tighten. Now, how does that translate into pneumonia? How does feeling shame and guilt, or being the second-class citizen because you happen to have been born a woman, or the wrong ethnicity, or something of that nature, how does that translate into a dysfunctioning set of bowels, irritable bowel syndrome, a microbiome that is not working? Your probiotics are not really doing well. The bacteria level is all out of kilter. How does that happen? Let's get back to grief. You all know what a blood vessel is? You got a tube. Blood is going through that tube. And then it goes away from the heart. It's red. Well, supposedly, it's blue coming back. Well, that's how we picture it. One has oxygen, one does not. Well, what happens when it gets down to the smallest little capillary? It's not a tube anymore, folks. If you look at a capillary under a microscope, it's more like mesh. It's more like a screen. It's like a colander, if you will. It's designed to keep most of the blood cells in the channel. But now the serum and the oxygen rich and the nutrients and all of those things which are meant to feed the cells actually pass through that wall in order to feed the cells. And the cells have been giving off waste products, which then can, to a certain extent, come back through into that membrane. And then it progresses and the tubes start to get solid again. And it comes back to the heart for filtration, the lungs for filtration, the kidneys, the liver, and suddenly we have clean blood again, and it takes a return trip. If I am holding a painful, contractive emotion like grief, fear, or shame, those capillaries start to get rigid. This thing which technically people call it capillary perfusion, the ability for things to pass in and out of that fine mesh tissue of the capillary, that gets rigid and it stops the level of exchange. So suddenly it's not getting all the nutrients. The tissue's not getting all of its waste products removed. You begin to have deteriorating tissues in an area. It's not too far of a jump to realize that held anxiety in the area of the heart then can contribute to heart disease, lung dysfunction, bronchial conditions. We'll just leave that, but it can also have everything to do with shoulders being rigid, because this radiates out. It radiates. If I were going to stand up, I'd say it radiates 360 and it contracts 360. The results can be felt all around the center of that target point.
I'm having a series of ahas. It's like, wow, I'm getting just before your next sentence or phrase. It's like, then that's going to mess that up. And you're giving the medical description of it. Like, wow.
Well,
So
I want to give it in a way that people can understand it, and hopefully, so far it's understandable. That's
it worked for me, and I'm not a medical person. I want to ask about today when you were working on me in the SHEN session.
Yeah.
Would you take the information you've just given us and what was going on when you were, I forget what your terms were, but in my lower gut area, you were pressing there, and I forget what you said, but I noticed a shift in me consciously. So what all was going on?
Well, you've just given me permission to break the therapist-client barrier, and we're now sharing it with whoever happens to be watching this. Are you comfortable with that, Terry? Are we okay? All right.
I'm fine. I'm transparent.
More so than you realize. When a person is receiving a SHEN session, we are simply, the therapist is using a portion of the field which we all have. There is a portion of that field between people's hands. There's nothing magic about it. There's nothing hocus pocus about it. It is a natural flow which all of us have, but few of us understand we even have it. However, in using that to stimulate or jumpstart, if you will, your flow, Terry, certain things become obvious. There are changes in your breathing patterns. And if this is your chest and this is your lower belly, and somehow it's a hinge, you breathe here and then you breathe here, but you don't breathe in the middle. It's not like a full bladder. There's some tightness here. Well, you are breathing in in a pattern that suggested this fella is feeling shame. There's some shame going on here because it was in his lower gut. It was, but your contracted heart obviously needed some work. And you were coughing a bit and sputtering a bit. And so I started with the shame and to bring that to the surface. What was the next thing that happened? Your left knee started to kill you.
Right.
And so I started to work on there's a natural direction to the flow within the legs. And so making my hands confluent with that, I took a hold of your knee, stimulated that flow, and I could then begin to feel it return to myself, my own flow returning, meaning, okay, it's gone through. I asked you a simple question. I said, what does your mother have to do with the shame you're feeling? And suddenly it turned to grief and sadness. Because above it all, mom did the best she could. That's the adult thinking. But as a child, it hurt me terribly that I wasn't good enough, that she'd never had enough money to take care of us properly, that she was suffering just so that I and siblings could eat. I felt responsible for that. I didn't understand what was going on. And I am still grieving the fact that I could not help or satisfy my mother.
And
How
what I'd
old?
like for our listeners to know is that um, Russ didn't share this during the session, and I'm now going, wow, I wasn't even conscious that I felt guilty about it. So, how much of the stuff that we have in us that you work with is unconscious?
At one time, it was conscious because it happened. We didn't like what was going on and it felt bad. And we tried to stop the sensation of that. I don't enjoy grief. And people who have been physically impacted, as we've talked about before, by grief, it's not because they've allowed themselves to grieve, it's because they've disallowed themselves to grieve. All emotions, whether they're joyful and happy, because heaven knows love and joy are functions of the heart as well. But these are lack of contraction. These are expansive, wonderful sensations. And we allow them fully and they pass through and we're ready for the next one. But the moment something that is not comfortable is felt, whether that be in any portion of the three major portions of the torso, chest, solar plexus, or lower belly, we try to stop that sensation. We physically grab around it unconsciously, but it's part of our hardwiring, this contractive response. We talked about the splint reflex around a broken bone.
Yeah.
It happens, but the attempt is stop feeling that. I don't like that.
You know what's really interesting is
that keeps it alive. That does not stop it. It simply suppresses it until the next time it gets triggered.
what's really interesting is that I'm now aware right now that I have been noticing for maybe 2 or 3 weeks more and more Facebook posts from grief coaches and memes about grief. And I'm aware as you're speaking is like, yeah, but I didn't want to read them. So defense mechanism.
Fritz Perls is the father of Gestalt therapy, and he made a very simple statement that the implications of them are grand, but that's exactly what we're talking about. And he said this: emotions have a life cycle. They have a beginning, a middle, and the end. If they are interrupted in the middle, they don't stop. They sit inside us, affecting how we feel, how we function, how we think. Every aspect of us is affected by these incomplete emotional episodes that we have tried to stop. They manifest in all sorts of ways. And yes, a lot of them are now unconscious until something triggers, and there we are. It's right back again. Now, how can we, as beings who really, okay, I understand it, but maybe some people are saying, but how do you get rid of it? Well, another lady, I mentioned her the last time I was on your program. She wrote this book, Carol with a K, Carol Truman. All you need is the title. Emotions Buried Alive Never Die. We never bury the good ones, the enjoyable ones, the expansive ones. It's only the painful ones that get embodied because we don't want to feel them.
So I'd like to ask our engineer to put that title up again of what it is that you do. SHEN Therapy Biofield. So you're describing our being as a biofield the therapeutics I'm sensing is what you do both physically and energetically, and then the physio-emotional, physical, emotional recovery and empowerment. So today, there was I was quite aware of releasing. In fact, um, I think you noticed as I was leaving, I leaned against the wall outside, and it's like, I just don't want to move. Um, I noticed there were two things going on. One, I was really tired. I was just, I just want to go unconscious, and the other was there was such a shift in me that I wasn't conscious. I wasn't as not intelligent. I wasn't as alert um, as I usually am. So, what was that process?
The normal stimulation that your brain receives is, I have to do whatever's necessary to keep this thing at bay. We opened it up. We allowed you to re-experience. We gave you the opportunity through the SHEN process to revisit that contracted, difficult emotion and more fully experience it. Dr. Rulin, who a lot of people know, part of her thing is go inside, feel, feel, feel. Well, I would say feel for sure, but allow yourself to fully experience it. Feeling it says become aware of it. To experience it means be 6 years old again. Go right inside it. Allow this now to finally complete. Allow it to fully develop. To a large extent, that happened for you today. You will remember your mom as a memory, as a history, but the emotional charge will be so much diminished from this point on because of the work that you did. I've just, as I said, jump-started and assisted. But your brain was not used to not having anything to do. You have been keeping your balance based on, well, there's this emotion that has to be kept in bay, and then there's this one that has to be kept in charge of. And okay, now I'm ready to go. You kind of undid that structure today. I was so pleased with what you did today. But for you to walk out the door and 3 steps later, you just sort of leaned up against the wall for support. I said, okay, that's great. Congratulations.
That was what?
I said, that's great. That's
okay. Why was that great?
It was great because you allowed yourself the experience of feeling to the point that your brain didn't now quite know what to do to handle. People
That's really true.
Shame, because you had shame and you also had grief. Both of them related to your mom. Being able to now finally, gently, through the SHEN process, move into that area and not just take a potato peeler and take off the skin one layer at a time, one blessing at a time, or one treatment at a time, or one pill at a time, whatever it might be. Our goal is not to foster dependence. I've told you that a lot. And that is to go in. And today you accomplished major work inside. And I'm just terribly pleased. I'm glad I could say this publicly to you.
So let me offer this perspective. If you haven't, for those of our viewers, listeners, if you haven't gotten it already, this SHEN process goes deeper, quicker than anything that I've experienced. And I've spent decades, 4, 5 decades, doing all kinds of stuff because at some level, I knew there was something that needed to get fixed. And I learned so much that didn't do much for me. I just didn't perceive hardly any difference at all. So one of the benefits of this type of work, and I don't want to bring the long title up again, but you've heard a hands-on, no pun intended, um, maybe it was anyway. You've experienced an actual, a real. Um, Boy, I'm losing the words on this one, but this perspective from the therapist and the recipient. Um, this is available to you, and you don't have to be in Portland, Oregon, or where are you in Arizona?
I live in Sedona,
Sedona.
Arizona.
So you don't have to live in any of those particular, or when he visits Portland, because he doesn't live here now. Um, Russ, would you say more about the remote SHEN sessions?
Uh, Let me back up for a second. I will go there. You see on the screen right now, SHENtherapynow.com. The sense of now is put in there for a very important reason. Not SHEN, what's the condition of SHEN therapy these days? No, that's not it. All of us are living in the past if we are impacted by all of these difficult contractive emotions. And we are living a life hoping and planning on the fact that our past is going to change. And one day in the future, our past won't be as bad as it was or as difficult as it was. Well, of course, that's foolishness. The past just was. And if we're thinking about the future and we're tied into the past, how effective are we now? How is it that we can bring our full awareness, our emotional selves, or our biofield, if you will, all these rotating, wonderful, intersecting fields, how is it that we can live a life being effective now? Without judgment, without condemnation, without needing to look to the past for meaning or look to the future for justifying an action. What's necessary now to make all my future nows the best they possibly can be?
So I'm reminded of Rom.
Therapy now. The desire of SHEN therapy is to allow people to become their fullest essential self and to live life without all of these emotional filters that usually change how we think, how we feel, how we are mobile. The difficulty between a good dancer and a really excellent one, or a yoga person who's trying, or one that really can do it, is the freedom, lack of contraction in the torso. One who does their own emotional work and can truly be in the now because they have completed, not suppressed, but completed this emotional work. They are truly in the now. And there is only now. That's all there is.
And so, how do you remotely assist people to move into the now?
In classic SHEN, it is a hands-on process where in proximity, gently, my hand is laid on the person's torso or a leg or whatever, and a SHEN table is designed so that our hands can go underneath as well as above, so that the flow can pass directly through the entire torso. All of that's very important. When a person in COVID or for some reason, for instance, I have 3 adopted sons in Africa, and I can't always be there. And if something's necessary and I want to give them a SHEN session, I don't have ticket money to bring them over for that. I wish it were the case, but I just don't. In classic SHEN, we don't look at the biofield, which those of you who understand Chinese mechanics and whatnot of the body and energy, we are dealing specifically with Hui Qi, which is this field that permeates and extends beyond the body and then returns through and circulates. But it's that outer layer, that protective layer. There's many ways of talking about it, but it is Hui Qi.
And Qi is energy.
Qi is energy. Now, it is possible that if you were in an iron lung, Terry, and that thick wall, let's call it cast iron, and it's 5 inches thick, we could do very effective SHEN straight through that. It's not a function of materials. As it turns out, there are practices and ways of working the principles of SHEN remotely, so that my hands and the energy that I deal with can tap into your energy. If you consider, Terry, right now, physically, you're about 20 miles south across the river and across the bridge, and I'm up here in Vancouver and you're in Portland. But energy does not know time and space. The field energy is what it is. And when I have the opportunity, I always prefer hands-on work, close proximity. However, when we're dealing with somebody who's in a far distant place for whatever reason, it's possible for them to sense the work. I can sense their bodies, they can sense mine, and it has nothing to do with hocus pocus. This has everything to do with quantum physics and actually just basic Einstein physics. Well, is there such a thing as basic Einstein physics? But in fact, yes. Remote sessions generally last half hour to an hour, just like a regular session. And I work where I am with this energy being, which may happen to be in Africa, could be in Europe, could be South America, could be just across the street, could be in the next room. Space does not exist in quantum physics.
And we're so grateful for Dr. Rulin Shu, the quantum physicist and string theorist. Boy, it took me a long time to say that one. Because she is bringing that to the world to a degree and at a level that hasn't been out there for the layman. And boy, am I ever a layman when it comes to physics. And what you're describing is, to take it a step further, in fact, the metaphysicians, Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching, and I don't remember much of the Mandarin, but there's no time or space, and everything is everywhere. And so you're able to, because you are able to connect with those concepts, then you've been able to, and so has your partner and trainee. Actually, you trained her, I guess, 30 years ago or so.
Aliel, yes.
Right.
Magnificent.
So the two of you have been able to transcend classical SHEN by your awareness of classical physics. And
I would have to say, Terry, honestly, and I need to say this for lots of reasons. I don't want anybody confused. There is SHEN, and then there is using SHEN principles and understanding in another therapy. I would still call it SHEN, but remote SHEN and classic SHEN is the difference between remote SHEN and table SHEN, where I'm in the same room or not. The same processes can happen. What do I prefer? Honestly, I prefer the classic one-on-one, that integrated thought and integrated feeling, and they're both powerful. And when one is not an option, remote usually is.
So speaking of remote, many of our viewers, because I've watched Who's Online every once in a while, I can tell, are familiar with the teachings of Dr. and Master Zhigang Sha in the Tao Healing Hands um, healing model. And
Yes.
I remember how stunned I was because I'd heard the teachings that you don't touch them, number one, so it's to a degree remote. But then I had a session with someone who called me from Australia, and I'm going, well, I don't know if this is going to work or not. And before I could even calm down after the Tao Healing Hands session, she was so effusive about her experience and the transformation. And I'm very familiar with the mind and the manipulation that the mind can do with reality. And I went, well, yeah, maybe. She might just be having some kind of a delusion too. Well, then 2 weeks later, I was again. This is before we used computer, so I was on the telephone with someone in France, and it was almost the same. Not quite the effusiveness, but it was like I only needed two lessons, not three or four. That wow, he said this remote stuff worked, and it really does. So I'm really curious, since you're also a Tao Healing Hands practitioner, what is your sense of use of, if you do, how do the two integrate, overlap, or not?
They integrate in an interesting way. And I will say it in just a couple of sentences. And then I want to also just explain from my standpoint and from what I believe is the Tao science standpoint, this whole concept of the biofield, because that's basic to our whole discussion. So let's first of all talk about what you asked. Tao hands requires that I have the permission of the person to give them that blessing. When somebody comes to see me on the table, they haven't come for Tao hands. They may think this is something they're not interested in, they don't know about it, and for me to then say, well, let me tell you all about this, it takes them out of the experience for which they came. And that is the deep emotional work. Let's just go into it. How can I use Tao hands for that person where I do not get permission for that person? I ask my Tao hands to turn on and please bless me so that my flow in my hands, which are the therapeutic instruments we use in SHEN, that my flow is as thorough and full as possible, that I might rid myself of any contractive response that could get in the way, to the end that, as appropriate, this dear person on the table might receive the greatest benefit from the work that I'm here to perform. So it's a Tao blessing to myself. Now, I would give that exact same blessing to myself if I were working with somebody 7,000 miles away, as I would if they were on the table. May my work be blessed so that they can receive. Remember, we are universal servants. We're here to serve. We're not here to direct or control. We're here to offer. And if you can offer a strong healing directly to somebody's biofield, they will feel it no matter where they are. I must say one thing, and I know it's 8:25 and we need to wrap up. The whole concept of biofield, the word, never existed till 1992. That will surprise a lot of people, but you'll never find it in literature anywhere before 1992. In 1992, there was a collection of doctors and physicists pulled together by the National Institutes of Health. And the desire was, they had an ongoing series called New Horizons in Health, and they wanted to do something specific to alternative therapies, and specifically energy-based therapies. Was there anything to it? Is there, how does it manifest? What's the truth behind it? What's the science behind it? A physicist, an American physicist, aeronautical engineer, a real brain, named Richard Pavic, chaired that committee. And they were trying to come up with this understanding. Well, prana, ergon energy, animal magnetism. They came up with the term. He suggested to them, let's just call it what it is. It's a field that is inside and surrounds our physical body. Let's call it the biofield. It was published in 92. It has now spread everywhere, and everybody talks about the biofield. But number one, they don't realize that it's not a single field. It's a collection of interacting fields. And number two, they don't realize that Richard Pavic was the developer of SHEN Therapy.
I didn't either.
No, yeah. So,
well, Russ, because of the time, that seems like a perfect place for us to end today's, what I hope will be ongoing. This is your second appearance, and I hope not the last, as a guest on Who's Your Neighbor.
My pleasure.
You have certainly given me, and I'll bet our guests also, now and in the future, although there's no time, right? An awful lot to think about. So that was Paddock. That was 30 years ago. And he was the developer of SHEN.
Yeah, he developed SHEN trying to disprove the whole concept of subtle energies. And he, in trying to disprove it, he realized, oh my word, there's something to this. As a physicist, I better figure out how this is operating from a Western standpoint. And when he did and published papers, he was invited to Beijing 2 years in a row in the 80s to deliver papers to the Qigong Medical Association in Beijing, because here a Westerner had finally understood the therapeutic uses of Hui Qi. Not just the meridians, which are so awfully important, and the various points where we needle and we pressure and all sorts of things. But they theoretically knew this other thing existed, but in 5,000 years, they never determined how to work with it. It took a Westerner to figure that out, and the marriage continued.
So our engineer has put up how you can connect with Russ Fox, Russell, if you prefer. And I want you to join me in thanking Russ one more time for one of the most fascinating hours, almost an hour, that I've had since we started this Who's Your Neighbor show. And Russ, thank you so much. And I know we'll talk more.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask our engineer to put up the link for the 5 levels of creation. See how quick she is? Boy, this would be so difficult to do by myself. So what are 5 levels of creation? This is one of the teachings that's inherent. Some of you are already knowing that. It's a part of one of the ways to understand how Tao Healing Hands works or functions, or what is it that goes on. So this website will give you book, chapter, and verse, an awful lot of information. Tao Healing Hands, the training to become literally a miracle healer. I'm just stunned sometimes at what people report to me has just occurred when all I do is say, well, dear, my Tao Healing Hands, please turn on and give them a blessing as appropriate. So there's 3 levels. Level 1, which most people are searching for when they come to Tao Healing Hands training. It's a 1-day training, 7, maybe 8 hours at the most. You don't even have to be present. You can watch a webcast. It's $150, and I know when I'm doing my own sessions, they're $150, and you don't have a permanent transmission that you can then use for yourself for physical, mental, or emotional issues for the rest of your life. You do with Tao Healing Hands. A month later, or if you've watched it by webcast this week and you want to do level 2 this coming Sunday, this is Tuesday, so that's what, like 5-6 days from now. Look at your calendar. I can't count right now. But very soon, if you watch those 7 hours and then connected with one of the Tao Center leaders here in Portland, they could send you the transmission for level 1, transmissions plural, so that you would be a level 1 healer. If you wanted to then offer Tao Healing Hands to others, that's what level 2 is. That level 2 is only $200. And again, you have that ability to do that, to use that for the rest of your life. There's a request that if someone wants certification, actually it's a requirement. If you want certification, you have to take level 3, and then you have to go through the 3 levels once every 2 years. That's only so that you can put certified Tao Healing Hands practitioner on your website or business card. The transmissions remain with you for the rest of your life. And the teaching is if you believe in reincarnation, these abilities go with your soul forever. So talking about a bargain. Anyway, in the chat room, and this will be there when people look at it in the future also, will be that link, 5 levels of creation, portland.com/Tao-healing-hands -Portland. So if you just click on it, it'll open it up. So with that, I would like to say good evening. I'm Terry McGill, and this has been another episode of Who's Your Neighbor? And Russ's more than teaching partner, his working partner, Aliel Kinder, has just posted in the chat room. Russ is in Portland right now. Well, actually, he's in Vancouver, Washington, which is actually about 15 miles from me, but it's just right across the Columbia River, that big bridge. And he's available for either single himself or what's called four-handed Shen with Aliel. So each of them have 2 hands. If you get them both, it's four-handed. I have experienced both, and they're both stunning, transforming, and boy, I really hope that if you feel called, don't hesitate. If you're able to do it in person, there's a difference because you're present. Mine have been in person, and I prefer that way. Russ does too. So with that, I'll just say good night. Tune in next Tuesday, or go to the facebook.com / I think it's Tao Center Portland, and look at some of the other episodes. And until next week, aloha.